Hello, welcome to a very teeny tiny monthly wrap up. So this is my January wrap up. There's only a few books that I'm going to talk about in this video, so it should be a fairly short one. How many other? There's about 6 books that I read this month. You know, it's the beginning of the year, things are happening. Life is kind of getting going again. I'm having less time to read. One of my goals that I also, oh, there is a fly on my. One of my goals that I set for myself this year was to stop reading books for the dopamine rush of finishing a book. I feel like that is a big part of what is so nice about reading, is kind of finishing a book, closing a book, and being able to say, I read this amount of books this month, or I've read like 3 books in the week, and there's nothing wrong with that. It is a nice part of reading, but especially last year, when I was kind of coming out of a massive kind of 2-year long reading slump, when I started reading long books again, I had to kind of teach myself how to enjoy longer books. So all that to say, my goal this year is to not stress about, okay, how quick can I finish this book? If I'm not finishing this book in, 2 days to a week, then I'm not, I'm losing my touch. I'm trying to just enjoy each book in the moment. And if that means that I'm not picking it up every spare second that I have, that's fine. So there are fewer books in this wrap up, but I can say that I spent my time with every book that is in this wrap up. I wasn't reading any of these books to have the number at the end of the month or to be able to lift a big pile. So anyway, needless justification, I will hop right into it. Got my peppermint tea here with me, bit too hot, not unlike the first book that I read this year. So the first book that I read this year, I would have been reading during the last video I posted of last year. So this book kind of took me over into the new year, and that is Vilette by Charlotte Bronte. So this is a really old and battered copy. It was in a book haul that I showed you this book, yeah. So it's a really old and battered copy. There are a lot of these kind of hanging around in thrift stores. It is a collection distributed by Haddon books. They have the kind of red title in the front, and then they have the author portrait. So I actually have my only other Haddon publishing copy in this month as well. But this is Vilette. It's falling apart. This is the one that I said I had to glue the spine back down while I was reading it, so it looks mildly flat now. But this was a 5-star read for me. Of course, the first book that I read this year, setting our expectations nice and high. It's a 5-star read, but up until the last page, and especially the last couple paragraphs of this book, I thought that this was going to be, a solid 4-star read. Nothing, blowing my mind, but, a nice, it's a good read. But without spoiling how this book ends, Charlotte! I remember I finished this book at nighttime, and when I'm reading by myself, I don't audibly react to things. I've said before, I don't really cry at books. I tend not to laugh. It all kind of happens in my head. But as I was finishing this book, I literally said out loud, "What?" If any of you have read Vilette, you know why. I don't know if my reaction to this book was overdramatic, but I ran to my sister's room. I sat her down on the bed. I asked her if she was ever going to read this book, and she said, probably not, it's not my cup of tea. She's not really a older classics kind of person, and if she does, she doesn't mind knowing the plot. I sat her down on her bed and I told her everything that happens in this book just so I could have her react with me to how it ended. Oh my gosh, this is one of my new favorite books. It's such a beautiful book. So to give you a brief kind of summary of what is happening in this book, so we're following a character called Lucy Snow, who is a kind of like the governess tutor sort of role that women would occupy a lot back then. And she goes to a fictional town in France called Vilette, where she joins a school as a tutor. So from what I did a lot of research on this book after I read it because I loved it so much. From what I read about this book, it sounds like it's kind of semi-autobiographical for Charlotte. This was her last book, I believe, before she died, but it was written after her sisters and her brother had passed away, and she kind of had no one in the world, and she was feeling really lonely and without purpose and depressed. And that was so interesting to read, because I feel like mental health and that kind of thing, for me, in the classic books that I've kind of read, it's always dramatized. It's always the crazy woman in the attic, or Dorian from Oscar Wilde, who goes out of his mind and with how he feels about his face. I haven't yet read a classic book you know, set in a kind of older time that handles just how life can negatively impact you in such a realistic way. And knowing that Charlotte Bronte was going through the emotions that Lucy Snowe is going through in this book made me feel like I was getting so close to the author. If I'm going to read books that aren't set in a fantasy setting, I love it when the characters feel human, and all of the characters in this book felt very human. You know, they were very complex. There was kind of characters that you liked at first that turned out to be assholes, and characters that you were really annoyed about at first that turned out to be lovely people. You know, there is some, always with classic books, especially with main characters being women, a lot of the time you have to kind of bite your tongue when there's some kind of older views on, you know, what you're allowed to do as a woman and what you're allowed to do as a man. And there is a little bit of kind of religious debate in this book, just a tiny bit though, and I liked how it was talked about and handled. I feel like I have never related to a main character more. Lucy Snowe, I feel like, struggles with a lot of the same kind of internal conflicts that I struggle with, you know. It was kind of hitting hard, I'm not gonna lie. It's kind of slice of lifey. It's a book about the unexpectedly traumatic and tragic and unfair lot of some who don't deserve it compared to those who, you know, have the perfect life and you know, seem to have not worked as hard for it, you know, and how there's no, you can't get around that. That's just how life is. Oh, one thing, this made me wish I could read French. I guess back when this was written, it was more common for, you know, dignified ladies to learn French, but there was a lot of dialogue in this book that was in French with, you know, and you know, there's no translation footnote or anything in this specific edition. So a lot of the time I just had to kind of go, yeah, when there was conversations in French, and kind of pick up on the clues of what was happening, which was, you know, I feel like I might have missed out on a little bit. Definitely a new favorite. I have my journal in front of me of kind of the notes I was making as I was when I finished reading this. And I wrote, I can't believe I just consumed that story with my own two eyes. And that is why I read. It's not for dopamine rushes when I finish the book. It's for that feeling of finishing the book or being in a story and just the joy of a story, even when it's sad, when it's just so like, wow, someone wrote that. Oh, okay. I'll stop rambling about the first book that I read this year, but this is already a favorite. This is already going to be on my best books of 2023. So definitely recommend Vilette. I read some reviews that said that Vilette was not as good as Jane Eyre, and I haven't read Jane Eyre for a while, so I can't kind of compare. But when I think about how I felt reading Jane Eyre the first time versus how I felt finishing Vilette, I personally prefer Vilette, but I might be biased. Before I keep going on to my next book, I figured out this month how to read classics, and maybe I'll make a video about it at some point, but I'll give you my tips now. Classic books, I have discovered, a lot of the time, and I think this is a common experience out in the world, they're not as easy to read as modern books, obviously. You know, they tend to ramble on a little bit, they tend to kind of have heftier wording, and just, they're sometimes harder to pick up. But what I have discovered is you can't read a classic like you can a modern book. You have to stick with it a bit longer. Like with modern books, like some of the books I have coming up, you know, you can pick it up, you can read a chapter, put it down, and it doesn't affect your experience of reading it. But with classic books, you can't do that, I have realized. You have to sit with them, you know, set aside a longer period of time to sit with them and go into the world and get more absorbed, because otherwise it doesn't have the same effect. They're harder to get absorbed into because they're not in our world. They're not written in ways that we can relate to. But when you do start, and I figured this out with Vilette, when you do start to sit for longer periods with the book, and I don't mean like, oh yeah, just read for 20 minutes, like sit down for an hour and read a classic, it's different. That was my theory that I carried into this month after reading Vilette. Okay, that being said, after I read Vilette, I took a complete 180 with the kind of book that I read, and the next book that I read was The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime by Mark Haddon. So another goal of mine this year is to read more books that have been awarded literary notice. This one is the winner of the Whitbread Book of the Year. I don't know what year, I assume the year it was published, in the 90s, I'm fairly certain. So this book here follows a young boy whose name I have forgotten. Oh, a young boy called Christopher Boone, who is 15 and has Asperger's syndrome. So I believe Asperger's syndrome, it's now been kind of absorbed under the autism umbrella. So he's not comfortable with emotions, he doesn't feel a lot of empathy, he doesn't get other people's emotions, and he sees the world in very logical, math-oriented ways. And it's about how he comes across a dog in his neighborhood who has been murdered and how he goes about solving that mystery. This copy here I actually thrifted, and I won't show you because I feel like it's a bit private, but I thrifted it with Post-it note on the front, and it sounds like it was for a nana who was giving this book to their grandson and asking if they wanted to meet up after, like, at lunch for a lunch date, which is really sweet and just makes this copy feel so like it has a history, and I wonder what happened to those people. This book was good. I can see why it was awarded. The voice of a young boy with Asperger's in this book is crazy. It's so well written. I'm not someone who's, well researched in the topic of Asperger's syndrome, but I feel like there was no mistakes. Like, he didn't forget that he was writing in the voice of someone with Asperger's syndrome, and it was such a good look into how that works, and how your thoughts are organized and how you move through the world. And he's got all these little details, like all of the chapters. So we're this far into the book, and that's chapter 29, because all of the chapters are prime numbers, because he's very math oriented and he really likes prime numbers, so all of the chapters are prime numbers. And throughout the story, he would kind of randomly go on spiels about math or, little things that he's obsessed with. And there's a lot of kind of charts and things like that within, about constellations. He's obsessed with space. So that was really good as well, that aspect of the kind of obsession that can come with that syndrome. Also, how he talked about kind of the anxiety that people with Asperger's syndrome feel over the smallest thing that we take for granted, like catching a train, was really good. I did feel like towards the end, there was one too many of those kind of charty sections, but then again, I guess would kind of be another accurate depiction of that voice, because they wouldn't have a sense of, okay, it's time to stop giving the charts now and tell about this really tense point of the story that we're in. So even though I was kind of like, oh, another chart, it makes sense. I wasn't the biggest fan of the ending of this book, because it is kind of framed as a detective murder mystery story, but by the time I finished the book and I thought about it later, I realized it's not really that. It's slice of life. It's kind of taking a point out of this boy's life that happens to be triggered by the event of the dog dying. So yeah, I feel like if you go into the book with that expectation, you'll feel a bit better about the ending. The people around Christopher as well, told from his perspective, is really interesting. They're very real people who are not the best, people who are just trying really hard, and Christopher doesn't get them a lot because he's not quite wired the same way. So I do recommend this book as well, and I can understand why it would have won awards. That representation is very important. So that was a good read. Happy to have read that one. The next book I read, I don't actually have a physical copy of it, was The Little Princess by Frances Hodgson Burnett. So this one I actually thrifted because The Secret Garden by the same author is a very nostalgic and important book for me. My parents used to read it with each other. My mum read it to us when we were kids, so I saw Little Princess in the thrift store and I was like, oh, yep, 100% would love to read that. I don't feel like I have too much to say about this one. It was a nice and sweet read. I love how descriptive it was of all the settings. Every time you walked into a sitting room, they were telling you about, what color is the china and the walls and things like that. It was real good at painting an image. It is a children's book, so it does go for the kind of typical happy, all nice tied up with a bow ending. So to give you a quick summary of what it's about a little girl whose name I have forgotten. I think it is Sophie. She goes to this, so she and her father live in India. They're very wealthy. She goes to a boarding school in England, but her father passes away, loses all of his money, and suddenly she's not the rich, posh little girl at school anymore. She's a lovely little kid, but she has money, so people treat her differently, as opposed to when she then loses all that money. So it's kind of about how that is navigated. Without spoiling the book, I wish the happy ending had been achieved in a different way, because the message of this book is kind of, people treat you differently when you have wealth, but how you act when you have wealth versus when you don't have wealth is what's important. So long as you remain a good person, whether you're poor or rich, that's the important thing. And the happy ending, I feel like, undermined that message a little bit. And I get it, because it is a children's book and they do want, the feel good, easy to be happy about ending. But I was kind of a little bit like, that message really could have been solidified in a different way, and I can't tell you what I would want that ending to be without spoiling the ending. But I don't know, if you want to know, leave a comment and I'll let you know. Yeah, but sometimes it is refreshing. As I said at the end of last year, it is refreshing to read children's books sometimes. You know, they have real simple, happy endings. They have real easy to hate bad guys. They've got the good messages. The story did have some similarities to The Secret Garden. You know, both were about little girls who came from India, who were orphaned. Although I believe Mary is the little girl in Secret Garden. She's a lot more unlikable than Sophie. Sophie's shtick is kind of that she's like a princess, which is why it's called The Little Princess. But I do think I enjoyed The Secret Garden a tad more. So if you did want to get into Frances Hodgson Burnett's writing, I would try The Secret Garden first over this one, but that's just what I think of that. Okay, so I read a lot of kind of classic literature this month. The next book that I read was this copy of The Lady of the Camellias by Alexandre Dumas II. So not the one that wrote The Count of Monte Cristo, his son. This is the other book of the Heron Publishing that I was talking about. So we've again got the red title and then a little portrait of old mate in there. This has been on my shelf forever. I thrifted this when I was like 16 because it's pretty, and I didn't know what story it was, and then I saw someone on BookTube talking about how much they wanted to read The Lady of the Camellias last year, and I realized, oh, that's this one. So when I read Vilette in the same edition, I was like, okay, I'm gonna finally read The Lady of the Camellias. This reaffirmed what I thought about how you need to read classics. I tested it, I sat with it for longer periods of time, I tried my, you know, sometimes you can't help it, I tried my best not to just kind of read a couple pages in and out, and that helped me to get absorbed into the story a lot better. So this follows a young man who falls in love with a Parisian courtesan whose name is Marguerite. It kind of follows their story. I feel like this does a really, really good job of representing the real struggles of love that is kind of started by real quick onset, and it's very passionate and fierce all of a sudden. You know, it follows, you know, all the jealousy and anxiety that can come with that, and what that can drive you to do, and how your thoughts can get occupied by that love, and how society and circumstance, especially in kind of 1800s France, can influence that love and how you think and how you feel, and how something so pure as just loving someone can get so complicated. I really enjoyed this, much more than I was expecting to. I don't know if it's just the translation of this book that I read. This story is originally written in French. There isn't a translator noted anywhere in this book, so I couldn't tell you which translation to watch out for, but a couple of times throughout this book there were a couple of sentences that were just ridiculously long, and they would kind of pop up out of nowhere, and it would take you a second to kind of go, okay, wait, I need to read that again and figure out what that actually said. So I don't know if that is kind of his original writing, or if it's just the way that this one was translated. And it wasn't that they were long, it was that they were kind of grammatically weird a little bit, kind of in the way they were ordered. I'm always pleasantly surprised when a classic romance convinces me of the romance. You know, I feel like a lot of the time classic books can kind of, they feel like you're almost a step back from the romance because of how, you know, that sort of thing was perceived back in the day. But I really believed in the love that's in this book. I was really rooting for them. I tend to only really root and feel with romantic relationships in more modern books, so it was good to see it in this one. Interesting as well, this is written in kind of the whole kind of Great Gatsby Frankenstein way of, I am somebody else who is looking in on this story and telling you as it's already happened, which I've noticed a lot in classics, and I wonder if that was kind of typical of books of that era. So yes, definitely recommend Lady of the Camellias. So then the next thing I read, working my way down my TBR shelf, was Molly Moon's incredible book of Hypnotism by Georgia Byng. You can barely see the title. This is a book that I've had on my shelf since I was a little kid. I don't have too much to say about it. So we follow a young orphan called Molly Moon who discovers a book of hypnotism at her library and discovers she's actually pretty good at hypnotism, and it's about all the things that she does with her newfound skill and the lessons that she learns along the way. I really enjoyed this when I was a kid. Rereading it this time around, I didn't feel the same zing of like, wow, oh my gosh, I can't believe this story. Maybe because I already knew what was going to happen, maybe because I'm older now. It is quite funny. It's got that kind of little bit of ironic humor at times. And again, it's that thing of when you read a book that's kind of oriented for, there is a fly that is intent on being part of this video. If you see him, just ignore him. He's very rude. There is that thing of reading books that are, geared towards kids, where it's just fun to read the caricatures that are supposed to appeal to children, or I don't know, it feels like quite a witty book. Definitely wasn't boring, it was quite creative. I just kind of, when I finished the book, I was like, okay, that was a good book, but it didn't hit the same as when I was a kid. So I don't have too much to say about that. And I can see how long I've been talking for already. So I'll just kind of, this is good. Give it to your children. Read it if you haven't read it when you were a kid as an adult, and tell me what you think about it. Okay, this is one of my shortest wrap-ups, and somehow I've managed to talk for ages. All right, and then, what's all going on? The last book that I read for January was a reread of The Little Women by Louisa May Alcott. So I have this beautiful copy that has been sitting on my shelf for a while. What are these editions called? Collector's editions, yeah. It was quite nice to read. It was quite stiff at times, but it opens, you know, when you're working your way through it, it starts to open far enough. So I have, when I was 16, 17, I read Little Women from my library, and it was this massive purple copy with an L on the front. And I think what I did was, we should name him. What should we name him? Robert. We'll name the fly Robert. I think what I did back then was I read a bind up of the whole series, because Little Women it's a couple different books. I'm not sure how many. So when I went in to read this one, which is just the first book, I was very confused when I finished the book, or as I was getting towards the end of the book, and it wasn't. This is not, how am I supposed to talk about literature? Anyway, I was very confused when I got to the end of the book and all of these big events that I know happens in the series hadn't happened. So I don't know, I guess it's a good chance for me to separate what I think about each book. So this is just concerning the first book of Little Women. And again, I feel like there's not too much to say about it. It's a very, very sweet story. It's not my favorite classic. It doesn't hit the spot like some others do for me, but it is definitely aimed at a younger audience. So I can tell how, if this was a nostalgic read for me, like if I'd read it when I was a little kid, how it would just hit a little bit different. Yeah, you know, it doesn't make me like excited like, you know, Vilette does, but it was very sweet, and there's a lot of like really nice, wholesome, funny moments in there. It's funny how reading it now as an older woman, I was looking at the mum in the story, Mrs. March, more than I was looking at the daughters, and I was relating to and thinking about how she feels more than I was thinking about how the little women were feeling, which is interesting. I think it's worth, I've said this before, it's worth reading classics at different points in your life, because you can take something different from them as you grow and change and mature. So this book follows, how many sisters is it? Jo, Amy, Beth, Meg. So four sisters. I am one of four sisters, although I do have the added benefit of a brother. And I think Louisa May Alcott was one of many sisters as well. So it was interesting to read her depiction of what it's like to be a sister of many. There were things in this story that I related to, definitely, and there were things that I was like, that is not how it happens. But it is a depiction of that relationship for a younger, it's kind of a simplified depiction of that relationship for a younger audience in 1868. But I did really relate to kind of that really close bond that you have with your siblings, especially when it feels like it's kind of you versus the world. So yeah, it was a very sweet read. Little Women isn't my favorite classic, but it's not my least favorite either. So those are the 6 books that I read in January. I'm happy that I read all of those. They were all books from my TBR shelf. Oh, honorable mention, I did try to read the first Outlander book, but I got about halfway through and I stopped because I had just watched pretty much the entirety of the Outlander series and I loved it. So I saw these Outlander books in a book exchange for an amazing price. I got like 4 of them for $7. It was incredible, and they're huge books. But I realized as I was reading through the first one that they're kind of like the draft of the show. I got to points that happened in the show and I felt like the show rewrote them and handled them better. So I was kind of getting disappointed reading it because I was waiting for these moments and I wanted to see, you know, okay, now I can see inside the character's head and how that they feel while it's happening. But it just was a bit underwhelming. So the first Outlander book, it's about that thick. I got about halfway through and then I was like, you know what, I'm going to stop reading them. I'm going to wait until the show is not so fresh in my mind and then I will restart and see how I feel then. So honorable mention for the first Outlander book by Diana Gabaldon, I think. But that is it. To finish up for today, I will tell you what I am currently reading. I'm currently reading the second book in the King of Scars duology by Leigh Bardugo, Rule of Wolves. I'm actually nearly done. I'm probably going to go and finish it up now. I am enjoying it. It's better than the first one, I think, but not as good as the other duology and trilogy that she's written that I have read. So I will leave my thoughts for that one for the next video. Thank you very much for watching me rant about the books that I read at the beginning of this year for so long. Stick around if you'd like to see me ramble about books some more. Take care, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.